Welcome to another edition of Throwing Out Some Heavy Light. My name is Aljamal Binding. I'm the chair of the board of MORE, Movement Omaha for Race Equity. We're an organization that tried to bring a great deal of racial healing in this community, and apparently we have some challenging times upcoming in this society. So we're trying to always find folks who can interview and talk to, and to help us to have a little bit of racial healing to deal with some of the injustices and things in our community. Today we have with us is Stuart Williams. He's a former Peace Corps volunteer who served in Central America over 30 years ago. I met him at a progressive Omaha meeting some 20 years ago, and Stuart and I had a conversation. He said the way we originally met was through some emails or through some correspondence that we had in the World Herald, and we had a wonderful conversation many years ago. He's been involved in social justice issues and helping to challenge the status quo, also regarding many of these issues that we face in our society. He recently shared some ideas and topics regarding getting more attention about the wretched condition of society and how we need to deal with dysfunctional situations. Stewart has worked in many occupations, and I think his last employment, he worked in a blue collar job with the U.S. Post Office, and he's currently retired. Stewart, I'd like you to share a little bit more about yourself with the viewing and participant audience.
Thanks, Jamal. You were asking how did I end up in the Peace Corps, and I think it's interesting, but it's not, on the other hand, exceptional. I had a liberal progressive parents, open-minded. They had me go to church every Sunday, and although I was quite bored during the sermons, enough of that rubbed off on me that I felt a sense of morality, a sense of needing to give back, because my life was quite privileged. And I had a friend in college that had volunteered for a charity organization, and she kind of inspired me to do that. And then I had a kind of a selfish motive because I wanted to travel. And after graduating from college, I had a degree, but I really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And so I thought, I'll take a couple of years to think about this. And it was a life transforming experience, believe me.
But what country did you serve in particular? Because I just said in Central America, which country was you in?
Guatemala.
Oh wow! So, and was there a lot of violence and things back there when you were there? Was it pretty safe and all that back then?
Uh, Good question, because the day I flew to Guatemala, I was in Miami. Jimmy Carter had gotten elected.
Mm.
Jimmy Carter, in spite of all of his defects, spoke a lot about human rights. And one of the first things he did was he cut off military aid to Guatemala. So during my time, the military was quiet. They were in their barracks. They they weren't doing a whole lot. And of course, at this time, I was still quite naive and ignorant. When Reagan got elected, which was right after Carter, I was in the US. He immediately restored aid to Guatemala. And by the way, their military is vicious, fascist bunch of thugs, put in power by the CIA back in 1954, by the way. There was one massacre during my time, and they called us all into the Peace Corps office and assured us that we were safe, blah, blah, blah. Well, this kind of got my eyes, got me to kind of thinking, and I read a book by a Maryknoll priest, which was called Guatemala, Another Vietnam,
Mm.
question mark. And of course, after I got back to the US and the military aid started to flow, and the death squads and the military were out in the countryside massacring people, I started reading about massacres in my own little village
In
and
Guatemala.
own municipality.
Wow.
And this was so shocking to me. And I literally from that moment on have been a different person, and it's led me to where I'm at today.
Wow, wow. Now I know that you spend time in California and Nebraska. Contrast those living experiences for us in a sense, because I know you go back and forth. What's that like being, living in Nebraska for a long time and all of a sudden you're in California? What's that all about?
Well, of course, I do live in Nebraska, but Omaha is a blue area, largely Democratic. Uh, California is largely Democratic, but I see a lot of hypocrisy out here. The so-called liberals continue to vote the Democrats back into power time after time. And don't get me wrong, I wouldn't support voting for the Republicans, but they live in their multi-million dollar mansions out here, and they employ their Mexicans or their Guatemalans uh, as housekeepers and nannies, and they must live. I don't understand literally how they make it out here. Housing for a one bedroom apartment is, I don't know, 2,500 a month, something like that.
Wow.
And so it's a two-tiered society, don't get me wrong, but it's very masked. If you drive out here, you'll see the mansions, and I live in a beautiful area, half a mile from the ocean. I get to take walks in the redwoods and in beautiful state parks. But behind the scenes, with $5 gas and horrible housing situations, it's like a powder keg. I just don't quite understand how it's going on, how it's going to continue.
Wow. Now, as we address the issues dealing with President Trump and the crazy thing that he has said, doing, and expressed during this discontent of many Americans who voted for him, how can we explain the election from a white male perspective? And so, one of the reasons I wanted you to talk, Stuart, is to give us perspective as we deal with racial issues. Sometimes we don't always hear from a white male perspective. So, talk to me a little bit more about what's going on from your vantage point.
Well, I have read a lot of these post-mortems, as they're called, about why the Democrats lost. And I think it's important to put it that way. I don't think it's so much that the people like Trump. In fact, he has a negative rating right now. But
Wait,
but
hold, you say got a negative rating, but people still voted for him? Help me understand that.
uh,
Translate that.
okay, because they looked at the other alternative and they didn't like it, and so they said we're going to give this other guy a shot. And granted, there's a lot of ignorance on the other side. We know that 70% of them think that Obama was born in a foreign country and he was a Muslim. And so, granted, there's a lot of ignorance. But on the other hand, it looks like about 8 to 10 million Democrats sat on their hands and did not even vote because they just were not enthusiastic about the Democrats. Um, I think Bernie Sanders put it best. He said the Democrats have abandoned the working class, and so the working class is now abandoning the Democrats.
Wow.
I don't see it as a racial thing. I see it as an economic thing.
Right. No, and also in Nebraska, we got some Democrats who are not the smartest. I say that up front because I've written letters to them. They don't respond. You have the head of the Democratic Party living in the middle of Nebraska, probably in the middle of nowhere. I don't see them campaigning and doing stuff. I try to reach out to them to do more engagement of those of us who are independents. But at the end of the day, Stuart, you can't help people who have the intelligence of an amoeba. But again, that's it. You recently attended a book discussion that we were at, and I remember that well because we were talking about grandma's hand and so on. What was your takeaway as a person from that event? I know, like you said, you deal with a lot of things, but what did you get out of that? Because we had extensive discussion with about 20 some people in that room at a Fabric Lab at 24th and Lake Street. What was that like for you?
Well, first of all, I love it whenever we can get together and discuss an interesting and a thought provoking book. And the audience was great. My goodness, we had Native Americans, we had African Americans, we had Cynthia, who is an amazing person. I really enjoy it just from an intellectual standpoint. But afterwards, it made me reflect a lot about trauma because I think trauma was the theme. And, if we had a functioning society and a functioning uh, Congress, that would be a huge priority because trauma has these ripple effects throughout generations, for heaven's sakes. So it needs to be nipped in the bud as soon as possible. Of course, the best thing to do is prevent it.
Mhm.
Um, and Jamal, my biggest when I spend most of my time meditating and thinking about international issues, Gaza, Sudan, Haiti, all of these horrible human rights abuses that are happening out there. And one of the biggest things that I see is there many times there's never any accountability. So you literally have generations of children being traumatized, growing up to be adults who are still traumatized. Um, look at what's going on in Gaza. I mean, there's many things you could say, but the trauma of the Holocaust is still with the Jews.
Mhm.
So that instead of reacting calmly and in a perhaps a criminal justice way, they reacted in a very vengeful, emotional way. And they are committing mass murder. Maybe it is genocide, but it's mass murder. And this is only 60 years after the Holocaust. So I think trauma and its effects is what it left me with.
Wow. You use the word trauma. I'm thinking about the CIA, the amount of trauma they commit across the globe. And obviously, the CIA has $1 billion budget that they get squandered and do all kinds of things. So they shoot innocent people, kill people all the time, overthrow governments. And, the Church Amendment has been basically Senator Church, I think, from Idaho years ago. That's how they kept them in check. And now they're in a position where they're just destroying governments and toppling governments and doing all kinds of dysfunctional things. And so we got to get the FBI and the CIA under control because it's obvious they're creating more animosity and trauma on an international level than anyone else is. I want to switch up and ask you a little bit different question. Few people in our community, and I know we just talked about a book, can read and finish a book and so on, as evidenced by social media. The decline of the bookstores in a sense, the public library is not being used in some areas, in some communities on a decent level. Why is that so? And what books or articles are required reading for those who spend too much time watching television? Again, you can see I'm not a great fan of television, but what can we do about that?
Well, I want to disagree slightly because I spend too much time on my damn phone and my
Oh,
devices. Um, but on the other hand, I have two grandsons, and they tell me all the time about things that they have seen on YouTube, which are very, very educational. And they literally have knowledge of things because of seeing those videos. And I myself see a lot of things on YouTube. So, but I mean, I don't know. I mean, Ajmal, like you say, I'm a blue collar guy, and so I've had many jobs where I've been in people's homes, very poor people's homes, and I swear it. I will go into these homes. There is not a book, there is not a magazine, there is nothing on the shelves. I grew up with hundreds and hundreds of books. My father subscribed to 50 magazines.
wow.
Um, so I guess in a way, it's your upbringing is what's part of the answer. And as far as recommended books, I did make a little list here. I would start with A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn.
That's a classic.
It is a classic. It's a must read. I think it should be a must read for everybody. If we don't know our history, we can't literally know where we've been, let alone know where we're going. And Mr. Zen comes at it from a common person's background, a union worker, a slave, um, the average Joe and Jane. So that's number one. Um, we just celebrated Martin Luther King's birthday. Read all of his speeches. Unbelievable. One of the most articulate, intelligent men I have ever run across in my life. Kurt Anderson, West Side grad, wrote a book called
When you said
Evil.
West Side, you mean somebody in Omaha?
What's that?
You said it was a West Side grad. Are you talking about a person who grew up in Omaha who went to West Side High School?
Yes,
Oh, okay.
yes, and he's been on NPR for 20 years. He lives in New York City now, but he wrote a book called Evil Geniuses. And it talks about how, I believe it was 72, 73, Lewis Powell wrote a memo. He was a Supreme Court justice that basically said we in the elite, in the business community, the millionaire class are getting killed by the left. We need to fight back. And ever since then, they have waged a campaign to promote their class. It led to Ronald Reagan. It led to Citizens United. And speaking of the working class, wages have essentially been flat since the 70s. It's unbelievable when you look at it. The only reason we have perhaps more income is because the wife has gone out and gotten a job. So now we have two incomes.
Mm.
But there's an astonishing statistic if you look at it. I believe it's starting back at that point. $50 trillion has been transferred from the working class to the 1%.
Wow.
And this is why, one reason why Trump has won. The working class has seen their jobs shipped overseas. They've seen Democrats pay lip service to it, but not doing anything about it. In fact, Clinton was the one that came up with NAFTA. And Trump is not the problem. He is a symptom of the problem.
Right.
Okay, another book. Speaking of MLK, Martin Luther King, William Pepper, the attorney for James Earl Ray, wrote a book called Orders to Kill, in which he lays out pretty convincingly, I think, that there was a conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King. And speaking of the CIA, Jamal, you got your budget way wrong. They don't have $1 billion budget. They have something like 20, $30 billion. In fact, it's part of what they call the black budget, which is secret from the United States. So we literally have a secret agency with a secret budget. It's really quite unbelievable.
Wow. You know, a lot of us don't get that in our local popular media or sound bites. So it's good to hear this news or hear things that, again, I thought their budget was billions and billions, but I didn't know exactly because, like I say, they don't even have to disclose to Congress.
We don't know what it is exactly.
Yeah, and that's a dirty shame. We pay taxes to an organization or entity that's funded by the public, and they go around murdering innocent people. Historically, we know of governments that have overthrown from, in Central Africa, Central America. We can name names of people who they have literally done that. I'm going to switch up. There's another question, and this sounds maybe a little different than what we've been talking about. Oftentimes, we talk about racial issues and more, and how we can bring the world together. And this question is: there's a lot of attention paid to global and climate change, warming, and so on. I noticed some of this from following some of the environment issues that impact some of the African continent, particularly they're having a lot of rain in different places, flooding. Sometimes it's much more hot in certain areas where it's normally cooler. Is that global warming a real issue? And particularly, does it affect us globally, or is it just something that happens in California or Nebraska when it's real cold here?
Well, I think it's clear. Yes, it is a real thing, and yes, it is human caused. I think that's been clear for quite a long time. I had a fellow explain it to me pretty simply. He said, and he was a physicist, I think. He says every tank of gas that we burn, every smokestack that you see out there, um, is energy. And we are heating up the planet every tank of gas that we burn. And the problem is that what's different about that is that the greenhouse gases trap a lot of that energy. Instead of being released out into space, it's trapped. And so it's easy to see we are increasing the temperature. In fact, we just surpassed the limit, which was 1.5 degrees centigrade, that was talked about as being a limit, um, whatever that was, 6, 8 years ago at one of the climate conferences. We've already surpassed that. So my understanding, I'm not an expert on this. My understanding is that there will be drought some places, there will be floods other places, because it doesn't really change the overall precipitation rate. It makes it more volatile. Instead of
Hmm.
having a 1 inch rain, you have a 4 inch rain. Instead of having a 2 week drought, you have a 2 month drought. And uh, I believe the Midwest is fairly isolated, or I'm sorry, insulated for the next perhaps generation or so. But it's unfortunate that it's the least developed countries which appear to be the most vulnerable. And so, yes, it's real. And even though it may not affect us personally, we should care about it because we're all living in one planet.
You mentioned that. I've been following the news in Southern Africa, particularly like Salalo program, and I know they've had floods in a place called Mahalapi where their bridges gone out. Years ago, we heard about Mozambique where they had great rainfalls. I know in Southern Africa, some people don't know it, in Cape Town, there's snow there. They've had all kinds of crazy weather they haven't experienced. In some parts of Africa, there's a drought that's even longer than normal. And again, people have a hard time with firewood. So those are issues that affect us not only in the United States, some of these climate issues, but even internationally, and we need to be concerned about that.
And if I could add, I don't think we should limit ourselves to just talking about global warming. We should talk about environmental damage because it's not just the fact we're heating up the planet. We are harming the planet in many other ways. Air pollution, Jamal, they say kills, I think, I forget, 5 to 8 million people a year.
Air pollution?
Air pollution,
Wow.
the particulate matter that's given out by the diesel engines.
Wow.
Delhi, for example, in India, where I visited a few years ago, it is enveloped in a yellow cloud most of the year. These children go out into it. Um, they their life expectancy is cut by, I don't know, 3, 4, or 5 years. We have exterminated a lot of the wildlife. We are poisoning the oceans with plastic and toxics. Um, a lot of our rivers are poisoned. So it's not just global warming; it's environmental damage. And
Wow.
I think this is the Achilles heel of capitalism. They want to pretend it doesn't happen because there's never any cost involved. If those costs were integrated into the GDP figures, then I think the picture emerges that we don't, according to a lot of people, our economy is just rip roaring and wonderful. I couldn't disagree more.
Wow. As you mentioned that, I remember Tim, who was the head of Nebraska Peace years ago, was invited to some conference in DC, and he was telling me that when all those private jets go to these international conferences or go to DC, they create this problem by because using fossil fuels and so on. He says he decided not to go because he said it was not worth it what it was going to produce. And then I heard about the international conference that was held. I'm not sure which country, but I know they had to fly across the ocean. And he says, you know, all these rich people coming out. And then I saw another article that said they had all these lobbyists who flew out to try to persuade them from enacting these kind of resolutions that would push back at it because a lot of the oil companies and fossil fuels companies were trying to continue their same rape of the planet of doing the kind of crazy stuff that they do. And so I learned a little bit from that because I think we have to again to have the conversation because too often there's those denials that people who deny that we even have this problem, and we can see the results of it. Stuart, one of the things that I'm sometimes perplexed with, and I'll just say this somewhat in a hopefully in tongue in cheek. In Omaha, we have many progressives who talk loud. We see them marching at 72nd and Dodge or different places, and they're involved in similar activities. Is it possible to improve the quality of life for many people of color or low-income whites in such a redneck state as Nebraska? I said redneck state as Nebraska. In other words, what does marching do and all this stuff that people do who call themselves progressive? And again, I'm not saying that in a disrespectful way. I'm saying, what are the outcomes? And maybe you can help me understand that.
Well, that's a good question. As someone who has stood on 72nd and Dodge,
I didn't know that. I just do
for
that.
quite a few times, I think it's somewhat useful if it will educate or attract attention because that is an intersection. Those demonstrations, however, Jamal, tend to be based about on though, for example, the Iraq War or the Gaza War, or something I would say global. I don't I you know you're absolutely right. We never stood on there and talked about North Omaha. When I first joined NFP, they had two main objectives. One was nuclear weapons, and the other one was the death penalty. And I pushed back pretty heavy on that. And I said, good heavens, these are not my priorities. I don't think they're the priorities of most Nebraskans. And Ajmal, you've been on the state board for a long time. I see that it has broadened its perspective. It does now, I believe, have a social justice committee. It does work a lot in the legislature on all kinds of issues. To answer your question, one should never say there's nothing we can do. That's the first step in cynicism and inaction. And we cannot afford to go down that route. Could Nebraskans for Peace do more? Yes. I think you know more about North Omaha than I do, so I don't want to say a whole lot. I would say that they share the same problems as the white working class, which is right now affordable housing, affordable health care, affordable child care.
Right. Very good.
And in addition, of course, we have a lot of childless, or I'm sorry, fatherless children.
Hmm.
And so I do have to say, because I've asked people in North Omaha, and they have admitted that yes, probably about half of our problem is internal. We have to work on ourselves as
Right.
well as blame outside forces.
Right.
If I were to wave a magic wand, I would focus on the children. Anytime there's trauma, that going back to trauma, that has to be dealt with immediately. There has to be resources, teachers, intervention, mentors. Um, um, you know more than me about this, so I'll have to really defer to you on that.
Sort as you mentioned, I agree with you that we have to do some internal and external, but the thing that we have to do is get those institutions, particularly those we support with public funds, to help us in the struggle because we should not have the disparities in low income situations when we have so much money in this society. No one should go to bed hungry in the United States or in the world. No one should go without shelters. And when you have people who have million or billionaires, there's something with our government who systems that allow that to happen. Just recently, I'm sure you may not be aware of it, but somebody froze to death in Omaha, okay, because the weather was so cold. Again, there could be other contributing factors to that. But my point is, heat should not be an issue in paying these gas and light bills to these utility companies when they're not using solar or community outreach is a moral issue and a shame that we're not doing a better job. And again, we need to challenge ourselves as people in our respective communities to do that. We're getting kind of close to the end. Before we do that, I understand you're living helping with your daughter and your grandchildren. What issues do they confront? What do you see them confronting in the next few decades? And also, what will our other grandchildren face, and I use the word grandchildren in generations not yet born, face from your perspective?
That's a great question, and I'm really quite concerned. I guess I've been quite naive. In fact, thought maybe about 10 years ago that we were close to a tipping point, meaning that we were then going to go into a better direction. Instead, we've gone into a worse direction. I am really very concerned. Um, I see a world that is becoming more violent, more susceptible to disinformation, misinformation. I see a political system that has been captured by the wealthy. And it's hard to see how we get out of that because the wealthy can literally buy a congressman. And that congressman will then perpetuate the vicious cycle by passing legislation that gives the wealthy a tax break or makes him immune, like in the sense of the Supreme Court, from our justice system. I don't have a good answer to that, except that, again, if we go back to history, we've seen many, many times that when things look worse, people have come together, they've pulled together, they've been resilient. I don't see any other choice but to band together, to practice solidarity, to be kind to each other, to educate. Maybe we're going to have to engage in civil disobedience, like we did back in the 40s, and back when the again, this is why we need to read our history. We take all these things we have for granted. The 8-hour working day was not given to us. We had to fight for that. Hell, there was a 12-hour day, and we had to fight just to get a 10-hour work day. People were beaten and killed over that. Um, um, we're going to have to stick together. We're going to have to. Jamal, here's one thing I want to throw out. The working class has a great tool to practice to bring about significant change, and that's something called a general strike. If you see what happens in France, many times when they have a strike, for example, the farmers or the bus workers, when they go on strike, every other union supports them. They literally shut down the country. Boy, that gets the attention of the politicians real quickly. The head of the UAW, the fellow who got these gains last year to get the GM and Ford to agree to these historic concessions, has actually called for a general strike, and I believe it's 2028 or some damn thing. My daughter goes Why in the heck do we got to wait till then? Um, this is a practical thing. If the working class were to say, we are going to shut down, we are not going to go to work, the billionaires and millionaires would have to pay attention.
Wow.
And I think we're going to have to be very creative too. We're going to have to engage in stuff like that. We're going to have to engage in street theater, humor, like I say, civil disobedience,
As I say, all of the above.
all of the above. Correct.
You know, one thing that amazes me, Stuart, is we just had election in the Senate, U.S. Senators Fisher and Ricketts, as far as I know, never set foot in North or South Omaha during the campaign. Senator Fisher, who's probably the most bland senator that ever exists, I don't even know how she got elected. Uh, she every day she had a picture on Facebook about her being with some white group in Western Nebraska or whatever, but it was almost like campaigning by just Facebook and showing her mugshot. And I understand her spouse would not shake the hand of Camilla Harris. And then the other thing that's somewhat unnerving is the fact is that there was no shame in their game. I mean, it's just unfortunate you got elected officials who supposed to represent the whole state, regardless who got elected, which party. They should be able to communicate or at least put their feet or their toes in parts of the state. And so it reminds me that we need to challenge our public and elected officials that it's hard to serve a group or constituents if you never listen to them or have any subordinates or anybody who can communicate them. So if we want to have representative democracy and government, we need to have people who are getting public funds at least drive by and let their GPS signal show they drove in certain parts of Nebraska, whether it be rural or urban Nebraska, but at least show that you care. And again, as far as I know, neither one of them, neophytes as they behave and act, have never proposed legislation that I'm aware of that will reduce some of the economic disparities and poverty rates and racial discord in our community. So that's one of the questions and issues we need to raise in statements on. We're getting close to the end, and I know that as we get to the end, I always like to have my guests to share any closing comments. So do you have any closing comments that you would like to share with the participants of people who will be watching this video now and maybe generations from now as we move into the future?
Well, on those last comments, and these are things that I have said to you previously, I see no alternative but to try to work within the Democratic Party. That doesn't mean that we can't support the Green Party and independents like Dan Osborne, but there's only two parties. We have to accept that. The one is completely hopeless, and so the other one,
You just mentioned his name, Stuart. Which one
the
is hopeless? Let's go
yeah.
on record. We're both retired, so we get to say what we want to say.
I even have Republican friends that say, "What in the world has happened to the Republican Party?" So, yeah, they're hopeless, and so I think we have to work within the Democratic Party, pressure them, do everything we can to push them in the right direction. And one of the main things that they have to do, and I shouldn't say that they and we have to do is to overturn this system in which money is ruling our country. We have to get rid of citizens. Okay, so I try to look at this rationally, intellectually. The root problem is that money is literally dictating every issue. If I want to change something commonsensical about the pharmaceutical industry or the ag industry, I run up against their lobby. Their lobby has hundreds of millions of dollars. They don't care about me. They will simply go to their congressperson and give them however much money they want. So somehow we've got to get money out of the system. Okay, then how does that happen? Well, the Supreme Court has ruled that money is free speech. The Supreme Court has ruled all kinds of bizarre things. So therefore, somehow we have to reform, restructure the Supreme Court. That's a huge undertaking. That's not to say it can't happen. I guess in history, there's been several times in which the number of justices has been increased. So that's a possibility. In fact, Biden didn't suggest that, but he did suggest term limits for the Supreme Court. That's something that has to happen because otherwise we're going to have Brett Kavanaugh on there and this other woman who I think are in their 40s. They could be on there for 40 years doing their damage.
So you get rid of them, huh?
I guess Jamal, one time I thought about the perfect platform to run on, and it's the most commonsensical thing either. It is common sense, common dignity. It's best to keep things simple. Common sense, common dignity.
Well, Stuart, on that line, Stuart Williams, I appreciate you coming on, sharing some insights. We oftentimes don't get folks to talk about some of these public policy issues, and I wish we get more people in our society who have a sense of comfort and safety to speak truth to power and tell what it's like. And so, really appreciate being on, and hopefully, have you come back again and share some of your insights of what you're dealing with. And also, I hear people say you should be honored for your duty to your country as a Peace Corps volunteer, your service to your country. They don't say it to us too often. But at the end of the day, we spent 2 years of our lives trying to bring peace to other parts of the world. And again, oftentimes we don't get the accolades or the points when you serve in the Peace Corps. Again, it's a difficult job for many of us. And I really appreciate your service as we do this kind of work to make our society better. So hopefully you can join us again. And we look forward to other future programs dealing with this topic.
Thank you, Jamal.
Appreciate it. Folks, hope you've enjoyed this edition of Throwing Down Some Heavy Light. Give us feedback and so on through our webpage and look for future editions of Throwing Out a Heavy Light. As we always end, may the force be with you. Baroko.